All right, let me ask you a question. What if I told you that installing less electrical equipment could somehow force you to buy a bigger, more expensive electrical service? I know, it sounds completely backward, right? But this exact puzzle is buried deep inside the National Electrical Code, specifically when you're figuring out power for buildings with a bunch of kitchens. So today, let's crack the code on NEC 220.55.
And get this isn't just some brain teaser. It's a real-world problem that pops up if you just read the code literally, word for word. If you get this wrong, you could end up designing a system that's way oversized and costs a fortune. This whole paradox is the perfect example of why you have to understand the intent behind the rules, not just the words on the page.
So think about it. If you're an engineer designing, say, an apartment building, you've got a big problem. How do you size the main electrical service for dozens, maybe hundreds of kitchens? I mean, if you just add up the maximum power of every single oven, cooktop, and microwave, you'd need a service the size of a small power station. It would be insanely expensive and totally unnecessary. Luckily, the code has a much smarter way to do it.
And the solution is this really important concept called a demand factor. Basically, the code is smart enough to know that you're never going to have 50 families all roasting a Thanksgiving turkey while also nuking popcorn at the exact same second. It's just not going to happen. So by applying a demand factor, we can calculate a realistic peak load, not some impossible theoretical maximum. This is absolutely key to designing an efficient and affordable system.
Now, to figure out these demand factors for kitchens, the NEC gives us a very specific tool for the job, and that tool is Table 220.55. This is the official guide for calculating the load for all your household cooking appliances, from tiny cooktops all the way up to big, heavy-duty ranges.
And here she is. Yeah, I know. At first glance, it's a lot. It's a wall of numbers, you got different columns, you got footnotes at the bottom. It looks super intimidating. But trust me, the logic behind it is simpler than it looks. The whole trick is just knowing which column to start with.
See, the table basically sorts appliances by how much power they draw. Column A here, this one's for the little guys. We're talking about things like hot plates or maybe some small countertop ovens, anything under 3.5 kilowatts.
Then you've got column B. This covers that really common mid-range stuff you'd find in most homes. You know, your standard cooktops, your typical wall ovens, anything rated up to 8.75 kilowatt.
And finally, we have column C. This is our home base. It's the default column for most standard electric ranges, up to 12 kilowatts. And here's the rule you gotta remember. You always start in column C unless a very specific exception in the notes tells you it's okay to use A or B. And this, my friends, is where our whole puzzle really begins.
See, the real complexity of this table isn't actually in the columns. It's not the numbers. The real gremlins are hiding in the fine print, the notes that come right after the table. And there is one note in particular that is the source of all this confusion and debate.
Meet Note 2. This is it. It tells us what to do when we have a group of ranges that are all different sizes. Now, the wording seems pretty straightforward, right? But the way it's written creates a logical knot that has had professionals arguing for years.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. This isn't just some academic problem. You can go on professional forums and find electricians and engineers going back and forth on this. This guy, Larry Bond, posted the exact question that gets right to the heart of it. Why does the title of the note seem to exclude the very appliances the note itself tells you how to calculate? Is it just a typo in the codebook? So let's actually dive into this debate, because it's the perfect example of the challenge of using the code in the real world. It really becomes a clash between reading the text literally, as it's written, and trying to figure out the original intent behind the rule.
Okay, so here's the first school of thought from a forum moderator. This is the strict literal interpretation. He says, look, the note's title says it's for ranges over 8.75 kilowatts. So if you have an 8 kilowatt range, sorry, it's out, period. You can't use it in this calculation.
But then another expert jumps in with a totally different way of looking at it. This is the intent-based argument. He's saying, hold on. Because you have a mix of different sized ranges, the main table forces you to start in column C. And if you're using column C, you have to follow its notes. And part of note 2 says you treat any range under 12 kilowatt as if it were 12 kilowatt for the math.
So you really have two completely different approaches here. The strict interpretation sees that phrase, over 8.75 kilowatt, as a locked gate. If you're not over that number, you can't come in. The intent-based interpretation says, no. The real instruction here is the part that says use 12 kilowatts for any range less than 12 kilowatts, because that's what makes the math work for a mix of unequal ranges.
And this is the clincher. This is what brings us all the way back to that paradox from the beginning. David Lucchini, the expert, actually runs the numbers for both scenarios. And the strict, literal reading leads to a totally absurd result. A smaller total appliance load requires a bigger, calculated demand load. I mean, that breaks the laws of engineering and common sense, which is a giant red flag that it's probably not what the code writers intended.
So, which is it? Which interpretation is the right one? Well, to settle the debate once and for all, we can turn to the official NEC handbook, which actually gives an example calculation. So let's walk through it step by step and see exactly how the people who write the code meant for this to be done.
All right, so here's the problem, straight from the handbook. We need to find the maximum demand for 4 ranges with different ratings. One is 8 kilowatt, one is 10 kilowatt, one is 15 kilowatt, and one is 18 kilowatt. This is the perfect mix because it forces us to deal with that tricky Note 2 situation head-on.
Okay, now the handbook solution follows these 5 simple steps. But Step 1 is the magic move. This is what confirms the intent argument is the right one. We take the 2 ranges that are under 12 kilowatt, that's our 8 and our 10, and we temporarily promote them to 12 kilowatt just for this calculation. That one move is the key. The rest of the math just flows from there.
And there it is, our final answer, 18.7 kilowatts. The only way you can possibly get to this number is if you follow the intent of Note 2 and include those smaller ranges in the average. The paradox is solved. The intent-based reading is the correct one.
So, after all that, you might be wondering, why does mastering one confusing little note in a giant codebook actually matter in the real world?
Well, what this all boils down to is a couple of really important things. First, getting these details right is the difference between a building that's safe and cost-effective and one that's just plain expensive and overbuilt for no reason. But I think more importantly, this whole example proves that with any complex set of rules, you can't just be a robot and read the words. You have to look past the text to understand the logical purpose behind the rule itself.
And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. This one tiny note in a massive codebook really shines a light on a universal challenge. When the written rule seems to go against all logic, which path do you follow? For the professionals out there whose decisions have real-world safety and financial consequences, knowing how to navigate that gray area isn't just a skill, it's a responsibility.